Hello and welcome to Juliet and Lucy's Quiet Leadership Revolution, the podcasts for senior and aspiring leaders who want to make their voice heard and their impact felt through thoughtful, reflective, confident leadership. People who want to lead by example, bring others with them, and who are ready to learn and adapt to deliver brilliant results. I'm Juliet Corbett.
And I'm Lucy Gower. And today we're going to talk about leading through change. And we've picked this topic because one of our listeners said, well, I've been looking for something around helping me to lead a team through change, and there isn't anything out there. Could you talk about it, please? So here we are. And one of my observations is how interesting it is that there isn't anything called leading through change when I started to look for it. So I think, as always, Juliet, I'm going to come to you and say, talk to me about what we mean here when we're talking about leading through change.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is, I think one of the reasons that we don't see many podcast episodes called this is because it's so embedded in what we do these days. It's almost like leading through change is just the same as leading. But actually, there's so much which is specific about change management and the way that people respond to change that's really important. So I suppose what I mean by that, so change would be any time that you're shifting the status quo of what you're doing, whether that's to do with processes and internal systems, whether that's to do with externally the way that you are targeting a particular segment of your audience, the way that you're messaging, all of these things, operational, external, internal, all of them, when you're shifting and changing the status quo, either accidentally or on purpose, is all change. And then the leading element is showing the way. It's sort of involving people, enabling them to understand the purpose of the change, showing the way so that people are able to do things differently, that you've asked them to do differently, and willing and wanting to do those things differently. And I think for me, there's also different types of change. So there's what the academics call incremental change, which, as it sounds like, is little step by step, little small changes over time. Generally speaking, just general good leadership will get you through that. But there's also transformational change. And that's where you're making a really specific change in the way that you're doing things. And that tends to be harder to lead. And then there's also a difference between emergent change. So emergent change is things that just sort of bubble up, that shift and change over time in the way your organization operates. And that's relatively straightforward, but not always. And then there's planned change, which is where there is an intention set within the organization that there will be a change that needs to be kind of enacted over time. So I think it's important that we realize there are different types of change as well. Lucy, what are your thoughts? Does that sort of coincide with your thoughts on what we're talking about here?
Yes, it does. And I think I quite often get called into organisations when there's some sort of transformational change project and help us to bring people with us, help us to manage this change. And actually, it mustn't be underestimated the impact that if you're leading a team, you might have different people at different points of change. Somebody might be heading up a project which is about changing something. Other people might be continuing to do what they've always done, and that's fine. But people are at different points within that change, a change curve, and there's something about how each of us responds to change, perhaps in a different way, that's important here. So yeah, not just going, oh, okay, well, we haven't got a big transformational digital change, other jargon word, project, so everything's fine, we're just going to keep going as we are. Your people in your team will be experiencing change inside their working life, but also let's not forget that our working life isn't our whole life, and for all of us, change is constant outside of our working life as well, and that can have an impact on how we're handling things in a working environment as well.
Absolutely. And I think one of the other things not to underestimate is how hard this is. So what you've just described there, it covers a whole range of different activities that are influenced by individuals' lives outside work, all the way through to changes in the marketplace, the way that different people are open or resistant to any type of change, let alone the type of change that you are specifically trying to lead them through. This is really, really hard. It's one of the most difficult things to do, actually, as a leader, is to lead a group of people through a transformational planned change. And it's really interesting, actually. Before this episode, I dived back into some of the reading that I was doing around my MBA around some of these topics. And that figure around 3/4 of change efforts fail. And I thought that I just
Wow,
made that
that's
up and like misremembered it, but no, it's there. I found that kind of in the HBR change management literature, and
yeah,
that includes kind of change efforts that either just are abandoned halfway through, and also change efforts that fail to deliver the expected benefits.
yeah,
Um, so this ain't easy, I
yeah.
think is what we're saying.
Yeah, and actually, I went back to some of my notes around leading through change, and there's a whole raft of things that I'd forgotten about. If I'm really honest,
Mm,
and I found it absolutely fascinating. I think one of the things that I keep coming back to for so much of my work is about how our brains are wired, and essentially, our brains are wired for survival. And so our brains interpret any sort of change as uncertainty. And if something is uncertainty, our initial response to that is a threat response because if something is uncertain, back in the day, uncertainty meant something that could be danger to us. And in order to survive, we have a heightened sense of a sort of awareness, which kind of comes back to some of the things we talked about before in terms of negativity bias and how we are alert to things that are seen as criticism or a threat to us in a much bigger way than we do to something that is perhaps a reward. So fundamentally, the thing that I took away is that our brains are wired for survival and we want to avoid threats and we want to seek reward. And even the words change management program, transformational change, basically for the vast majority of us, that initiates a threat response. And there we have the complexity as a leader of being able to manage that when you're also managing that for yourself as well.
yeah, absolutely. And it, it it kind of initiates a different response in different people. And even those of us, and I think
Yeah.
Lucy, you and I probably would put ourselves in the camp that are quite open to change. We quite like change,
Yeah.
like trying new things. Generally
Yeah.
speaking, we're at that end of the spectrum. But even us, you can
Yeah.
imagine if you're in an organization, you open an email and it's about some new transformational project, all of those questions that get sparked, where's my place in this new system, this new
Yeah.
hierarchy that they're creating, or this new project that they're introducing, or something that they're going to stop doing. And all of it is that fight, flight, freeze
Yeah.
response. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. And I really like change. And I'm currently doing a whole lot of changes in my business, more of that to
Mm-hmm.
come. And I'm aware of the flight, fight, freeze response that I am having. And I'm doing a lot to manage that. And I think this is perhaps why sometimes people say, yeah, I really like change, kind of bring it on. Come on, we need to change. The world's changing. Our business needs to change. Our customers' needs are changing. But when it actually comes to implementing that change, it doesn't always feel great. It feels like a maybe scary, maybe emotional, maybe difficult. Maybe I talk to quite a lot of clients that talk about wading through treacle,
Mm,
and feeling that resistance.
yeah,
So I think it's just like we said, not underestimating how
yeah,
difficult that
absolutely.
can be.
And interesting, actually, the same listener, I'm not going to name check you, don't worry, but the same listener who suggested this topic also sent me an HBR article, and it was talking about the importance of stability. And in that article, it lists, well, I'll put a link in the episode notes, but it created a really strong connection between the psychological effect of reading, this email about this hierarchy change, or structure change that's coming, or whatever, this transformational change that triggers this emotional kind of reaction. Basically, it introduces uncertainty, whereas previously you had
Mm,
certainty. It sometimes, depending on how it's managed, will reduce your sense of agency, so your feeling of having any control over your
mhm,
situation. Um, and then it kind of means that potentially those sense of belonging to the organization, the social networks that you've built up, the rituals that go with the way things are done as the status quo, your sense of strong understanding where you fit in and the value that you
mhm.
bring, all of that, depending on the type of change, all of that could be challenged. And
Yeah,
here we're talking about fundamental psychological kind of imperatives that we seek as humans. We seek certainty, we seek a sense of agency, a sense of belonging. And so challenge all of those things through a change project. And it's not surprising that you get some people who are less willing, shall we say, to embrace that change, and in fact will sabotage that change. And it's often from a place of their psychological safety being challenged in that organisation, rather than a sense of mischievous intention and in their sabotage.
Yeah, absolutely. And the sabotage can often be subconscious or unconscious. It's not a deliberate act of sabotage. It's through their behavior playing out in order to keep themselves safe, that can happen.
Exactly.
So I think, if we think about what the world of work is like, change is one of the constant things. Like, change is always going to be happening, whether it's a big project or whether it's being able to adapt to different needs. So I wonder if it's helpful thinking about, as leaders, helping to manage yourself and others through that change. What are some of the practical things that we can all do to essentially reduce that threat response and increase that reward response, to make the path of going from A to B as smooth as possible? And I say smooth as possible. I don't think it's ever going to be really smooth.
Yeah.
There's going to be bumps in the road, but how can you, as a leader, best create that path for your people?
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think step number one is? What's the first thing that's required, Lucy? I'm going to put you on the spot.
Yeah, back at you.
I've got my ideas, but I'd love to hear you.
Yeah. So I think that there's so many things that all interconnect. I think the first thing is being really clear on why the change is necessary, but not you as a leader going, we're going to change because of X, Y, and Z. There's that piece about agency. People don't like, we as human beings don't like having change done to us. It's about understanding why the change has to happen and what your part in it is and what that might look like. So I think sometimes as leaders, and I've certainly been in organizations where this has happened to me, there's a all staff meeting to introduce this change that's going to happen, and you're often, even if it's been delivered in the best possible way with a really good Q&A session, which no one really wants to put their hand up to because you're still in shock mode, there's something around that first bit of communication that is about asking people for their opinions, their thoughts, their insight, helping them to get from, we need to change because of all these different factors that are happening, so that they have a sense of agency. And I understand that, leaders of organizations, that can be frustrating. Sometimes it's not possible because you have to respond really, really fast. But if it is a planned piece of change, to spend more time than you think helping people to come to their own conclusions about why change is important and what that means for them, rather than that feeling of change being done to you, because you're already as a leader on the back foot, because people's first response is kind of, no, we want to stay as we are, and you've got more work to do, even though I acknowledge it can feel frustrating because that takes time and effort in order to be able to do that.
Absolutely. So there's a couple of things in there to unpack which are experienced at the same time, but actually have a couple of different elements. So one is, I think you're talking about there, the importance of actually involving people in the process so that they feel that they are part of a change program, not that it's being done to them. So that's an integral part all the way through.
And an important bit in that is that it's not lip service.
Yes.
It is genuinely asking for people for their thoughts and input. And the organisation might not fundamentally agree with everything, but allowing people to voice that, but not being like, oh, we're going to do this change and it looks like this. Oh, hang on a minute, we'd better ask people, but we're going to do it like that anyway.
Oh, it's the worst. It's the absolute worst. Please don't do that. Yes, absolutely. So there's involving people. And then the second part of what you were talking about was diagnosing what the problem is and what you're going to do about it. And those are two separate things, but they're best done together. So there's this sort of strategic piece of what's the key problem that you're trying to solve, and brainstorming all different ways of solving that problem, and then coming to a convergent decision-making process that enables you to decide on the actual things that you're going to do to overcome that problem. Now, that is a fundamental strategy or challenge-based strategy approach, which I'm sure we will talk about again because I'm slightly obsessed with strategy, as people listening might know. So there's this strategic imperative that you don't change just for the sake of it, because it's hard and it's unsettling. So you don't do it unless there's a
Yeah.
really good reason to change. So you're looking for what is the right change to be putting in place. And then separately, we've got this idea of involving people. And I think that often we think of them together because they're best done together. But sometimes it's
Hmm.
also really important to separate the two in your mind and think, actually, we've got two purposes here. One is that the more people we involve, the better a more robust decision making and strategy we're going to end up with, because you've got a more diverse set of viewpoints. You've got viewpoints from the people that are actually dealing at the kind of the front end with customers and people who are dealing with operations, and all these different people are involved in the decision making. And then simultaneously, you've got this involvement, and that then creates a better strategy and then buy-in to actually deliver,
Yeah.
especially if there's going to be kind of a hard slog. If you're dealing
Yeah.
with a big transformational change, it's going to be a hard slog. So you need to get people bought into the process.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I find really interesting around this is, so most of my experience has been with medium-sized organizations. So I guess kind of 500 to 2,000 employees, that kind of size. Now, when you're that scale, you can design ways in which you involve people, but you want to be
Hmm.
really clear with them where you want their involvement, and that you're
Yeah.
probably looking for ideas and feedback and thoughts to contribute to the process, but that the decision making action is happening in a particular forum that is much more kind of tightly defined. Um, but it's really interesting the way you can design processes that enable that interaction and that involvement to happen, but don't give people a misleading impression that actually we're
Yeah.
asking you and therefore we will do everything you say, because actually that's also not realistic. Just like it's
Yeah.
not realistic to ask people and then already have the solutions in mind. You're just going to
Yeah.
roll them out regardless. So maybe there's another whole episode there on designing a
Yeah. Yeah.
process
Yeah.
that's appropriate for your size and type of organization.
Yeah. And the real clear communication that goes with that.
Definitely.
And then I think on that, often what happens, I facilitate a lot of workshops, and part of that is what happens next. And so in what you've just said about designing a process where people are involved, where you're asking for people's thoughts, opinions, and insights, but you're very clear about where the boundaries are in terms of how that insight will be used and how decisions will be made. There's that piece around communication through a change process. And there's something about uncertainty. And with a change process, there is always going to be uncertainty, because you might know where the destination is that you're going, but how you get there isn't like always a linear path. But I know organizations that I've seen do change extremely well are really good at communicating
Yeah.
and trying to build in certainty to the communication. So for example, at midday on a Thursday, there's a communication about where we've got to, like what's progress and what's coming next. Even if there isn't an update or any new information, there's still a communication on Thursday at midday that says we've got no updates. It's exactly the same as last week still, because we're all still
Yeah.
working on it. But that provides an element of certainty, and everyone is getting the same information at the same
Mm-hmm.
time.
Mm-hmm.
Because the danger is, if there's any leakage of communication, you kind of get like whispers around the organization about what might be happening or what isn't happening. And what our brains do, if all the information isn't there, we fill in the gaps. And we fill in the gaps more likely with the worst case scenario than the best case scenario. So that real tight communication is really key.
It is really key. And actually, one of the most difficult forms of change is restructuring, because there is also a legal framework into what you can share and when, and
Yeah.
there is an inherent uncertainty built into some of those processes. So where there is uncertainty, you can at least clearly and honestly communicate, we don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know the answer to all of these questions that will emerge on the following timescale. This is the timescale we have in plan. This is what we are doing. This is how we're making this fair and as open as it's possible to be. But a lot of these things, it's similar with any sort of merger negotiations where there's confidentiality involved. Any of these structures of change which impede your ability to communicate, clearly and openly for legal reasons or for negotiation reasons, being really clear about what you can communicate, and being really clear that yes, there is
Yeah.
uncertainty, and that is just where we're
Yeah.
sitting at the moment.
And I think as a leader through that, to be able to say, I don't know, like
Yeah,
we're going through this to an extent, we're going through this together. I don't know the next bit of the puzzle. I don't know the next bit of the outcome. And that can feel extremely uncomfortable because often we feel like we want to be able to guide the way for people. And we are by being clear of we don't know what's happening next,
yeah,
rather than kind of make something up to
yeah,
make you feel better, or perhaps provide somebody with information with the best of intentions, with information that isn't correct. So as a leader through change, becoming comfortable with that uncomfortable feeling of I don't have a crystal ball, I don't know exactly what's going to happen next,
yeah,
but I know that these are the steps that we're taking, and
yeah,
I promise that I'm going to communicate with you every step of the way. It's not like I know something and you don't. We're all together moving in the direction that we agreed to together, that we're going to get to for the really good business reasons that we've also agreed.
exactly. And what you're doing there, you mentioned the wish to guide people, and you're absolutely right. But what you're doing there is guiding them by being a role model and saying, I acknowledge this is uncomfortable. I acknowledge that uncertainty isn't a nice place to sit. This is how we're going to do this together. And you're role modeling that sort of calm, logical, step-by-step process, trying to role model the understanding that emotion will inevitably play a role for some people, for everybody, sorry, not for some people, for everybody, and that it's just a case of being able to spot your emotional response, to regulate that as appropriate, and then to share with others, this is how I'm feeling right now. I'm feeling really unsettled. I'm feeling really fearful. I'm really, not comfortable, not finding this uncertainty comfortable. And to be able to role model to others kind of a calm step-by-step process, even through uncertainty, enables others to be guided in the
Yeah.
process.
It also enables others to be able to share how they're feeling emotionally as
Yeah,
well. So there's something here, I think, about leaders being able to tell their own story about how they're feeling, their response, their wish or desire for what the new future looks like, that I think is really powerful, because through leading by example, we know that we have human beings have emotional response to change. And sometimes I notice when I'm working with teams that when we're in a professional context, we feel like it's not okay to be emotional. And I agree that responding from an emotional place, you're less likely to say what you want to say and get the results that you want to get if you're coming from an emotional place. But as a leader, if you're able to talk about how you feel and your emotions, you're giving permission for other people to do the same. And talking about how we feel can help to move us to a more rational place where we can make better informed
yeah,
decisions. And that in itself, I think, can be helpful, just to be able to listen and
yeah.
acknowledge that emotions play a big part in any sort of change process.
Absolutely. And actually, just to build on that as well, I think for the leader, so wanting to create a secure, kind of psychologically safe environment for your team to
Mm.
share these things, either one-to-one with the leader or in the group, is really important. The leader themselves has a slightly different role. So it's really hard for the leader to go into a team meeting and kind of share it raw
Yeah,
emotion. So it's about creating for the leader a network in which they can, or a relationship in which they can express that raw emotion, and then work it through so that what they express to their team is a slightly more
yeah,
processed. I've considered this. I'm not
yes,
reacting from the emotion. I'm acknowledging the emotion. I think that's where
yeah,
coaching can be really, really helpful as a safe, secure, confidential
yeah,
space to share some of that, to work through some things separately. But even if you don't have access to executive coaching, there's peer groups, there's potentially people outside work, mentors that you might have worked with either inside or outside the organization who are more senior. Obviously, being careful around confidentiality, but finding a way that you as a leader can process this emotional journey that's not in front of your team. but then being able to
Yeah.
acknowledge and be able to talk about the emotion, but not acting from the emotion.
Yes, exactly. So to be able to go to your team and say, and that's where the storytelling
Mm.
comes in, I think, say, hey, when I was first starting to talk about this, I felt angry, confused. And then I started to understand about X, Y, Z. You can present the change as a story, being candid about how you felt about it, to just open up the conversation that it's all right to not agree or to feel upset or to feel bereft because how you currently do things is going to change. There's often something about letting go of how we currently do things here in order to be able to move forward into the the new
Mm.
way of doing
Mm.
things. And that's
Yeah.
emotional journey, and it's hard to move on to the new thing until you've let go of
Yeah,
the
it's
old
almost like there's
thing
a
in
grief
many
process
contexts.
potentially, especially
Yeah,
especially sometimes I see that around mergers as well, where the more junior member of the merger is then subsumed into or
yeah,
sort of acquired into a larger. There is a sense of grief sometimes for that culture.
yeah.
Often not the organization. No one misses the logo particularly, but the culture that was, and then the culture that is.
Don't say that to the brand
Sorry.
team. Do not say that to yeah.
Obviously everybody misses the old logo. But it's around the relationships and the culture that you had felt really comfortable in
Yeah,
previous to the merger, then shifting everything
yeah.
up. There's a phrase actually, which is not a particularly, I don't think it's a particularly pretty phrase, but it kind of speaks to what we're talking about, which is the idea of you speak from the scar, not from the wound.
Oh,
Yeah, so the idea being that once you yourself have healed
mm-hmm.
something emotional, something traumatic, something difficult, once you have healed, speaking from that position about that story or that situation is really powerful.
Mm,
So doing that for your team and saying, well, actually in my last organization, this is the process we went through, this is the way it felt, and actually in the end, everything turned out okay. So you're speaking from the scar. But as a leader, if you speak from the wound, meaning something which is current, something you're currently living and dealing with and healing through now, probably best to keep that for you and your coach, or you and a trusted peer, or
yeah,
you and somebody outside of work, a trusted friend
yeah,
or family member. And so that's really helpful actually to working out how much storytelling is helpful and how
yeah.
much actually if you're still processing all this, just keep it to yourself for now,
Yeah, I've never
from your
heard
team.
that expression before. I love it. I'm
Yeah.
going to implement that immediately. But it makes me think of something else that I think that's just really important to mention here. And I feel like we're just sort of scratching the surface with
Mm,
talking about this. I think there's more episodes around leading through change here, but allowing time and space, not just for you and your peer group as a leader to debrief and listen, but giving space for your team, your organization to talk through things so that they can speak from the scar, not from the
yeah.
wound. So whether
Yeah.
that is drop-in sessions, Q&A sessions, whether that is, time in one-to-ones across the whole organization of tell me how you're feeling about the change, where are you at? And not trying not to fix it or not to go, here's solutions, look, here's the project plan, everything's fine, but just to hold that and listen, because the process of talking through something is incredibly helpful from moving from a emotional to a more rational place, but also to just kind of that piece around not wanting things, not feeling like you want change done to you, but to feel part of it.
Yes.
Sometimes talking it through helps you to kind of catch up.
Yeah. And actually that catch up, that is a really important phrase actually, because the other thing that can happen as well is that the leaders of change often, but not always, might know about this for longer before the rest of the team
Yeah,
and be involved in some of the early preparation and discussion. Even if you're planning to involve your team, there will be a pre-discussion about how do we do that in the best possible way. So you will be ahead, not in the sense of being superior to, but in the sense of
mm-mm.
having had longer to process some of this compared to other people. And
Yeah,
so allowing time for people to catch up is really important. Also acknowledging that people process this at different
yeah.
speeds, at different pace.
Yes, because there's a change curve model that we can share in the notes, but the change curve model is based on a grief model.
Mm-hmm.
It starts with shock, then anger, then acceptance, and then like, how do we get on with this? So if you as a senior leader have gone through shock and anger and you're in acceptance, but the rest of your organization is still managing through shock and anger, yeah, giving them the time to catch up and get you all in the same
Yeah.
spot in the curve, even though that may not be possible because people go backwards and forwards across the curve. I've never thought about it like that, Juliet,
Yeah.
actually.
But
So that's a really good
inevitably,
point.
rushing people through it is unlikely to be particularly productive.
Yeah, you've got to go at your own. Each individual has
Yeah.
to go at their own pace. And if there's a
Yeah.
leader, you can allow them the time and space to do that and have a little bit of an understanding of where they're at.
Yeah.
You can manage your conversation to help them at the point where they're at. Not and it's not about the point where you're at, it's
Yeah.
where they're at.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels to me like there's about 15,000 other things that we could talk about.
Yeah,
Before we wrap up our episode on this one, I feel like this is multiple future episodes that we'll
agreed.
be touching on this. Um, One of the other things that might be really useful to mention now is this idea that resistance to change, we've talked about quite a lot of the emotional side. There's also a real practical side to this as well. And so making sure that whatever you're doing actually creates an opportunity for the members of the team that you're leading or the organization you're leading to actually have the skill set to be able to do the new things that
Mm,
you're asking them to do. So this isn't just
mm,
about aptitudes and emotion and beliefs and so on. This is also about behavior
mm.
in terms of the actual skill set. So I think there's also a really important part in here about one-to-one or group conversations which analyze what are the new skills or new expertise that we need to
Yeah,
enact this change. And that could be as obvious as, we're introducing a new CRM, so we need to have a training session on how the new
yeah,
system works. But it's likely that was also going to be
yeah,
slightly more
yeah,
unexpected skill
yeah.
set that's required.
There's also going to be potentially like, okay, we're going to switch our model so that our customers are always central. So what does that look like in terms of how we work? Our silo working, as an
Yeah.
example, needs to shift because now we have got a different mindset about how we're approaching our work. That needs a different sort of training, which
Yes.
maybe feels more complex than here's the fields that you need to use for a particular CRM. There's a mindset shift in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, as a general rule of thumb, anything to do with shifting cultural mindset is more complex and will take longer
Yeah,
than implementing a
yeah,
new
yeah,
technology solution or whatever it might be.
yeah,
And then the final
yeah.
thing I wanted to mention, so we just don't forget this, is
Mm-hmm.
the importance of sustaining the change after you think you've embedded it.
Oh my
It
gosh, yeah,
always takes longer than you think. Actually, that's a good rule for change, full stop. It always takes longer than you
yeah,
think.
yeah,
But even when you think you've got to the finish line and that final milestone in your project plan has been reached, and you can celebrate success, that isn't the end of the journey.
yeah,
And the number of times that things will then either slip
yeah,
backwards or, depending on what the change is, kind of erode the
yeah,
benefits over time.
yeah,
So there's something about putting in place planning and thinking around what happens to
yeah,
sustain this
yeah,
change through time as well.
yeah. Because human beings, we like to go back to what we know. So there's a really strong urge to go back to how we've always done things. And so yeah, maintaining the new way
Yeah,
mustn't be forgotten. Yeah, you're so right.
yeah, definitely. So, wrapping up this
Mm,
conversation, what are the key things that you think you'd like people to take away from our conversation?
I think looking after yourself as a leader in this, don't underestimate that you've got to look after yourself. You've got to be okay now in order to help your team be okay. Easier said than done. I think just holding on to remembering how our brains are wired, that we want to avoid threat and we want to seek reward. So within everything you're doing within change, what does that look like? How can you reduce the threat and the uncertainty through communication? And I think like change is happening all the time. We're never the same. Nothing's ever static. So being able to manage any sort of change as a leader for yourself and for your team is, I don't like the term future of work skill, but like that is essentially what is needed, as the rate of change is only going to accelerate, in my opinion. What about you, Juliet? What are your kind of three takeaways for people?
I think the first takeaway is not all change is the same. So, even if you're not currently going through a big transformational change, you are still leading through change pretty much all the time. Um,
Mm-hmm.
And then the fact that this isn't easy. And so being kind to yourself, giving yourself the time and space to think these things through. And it will take longer than you think.
Mm,
It will need more effort than you think. And so just understanding the scale of the challenge, but not being put off by that, but recognizing that
mm-hmm,
it isn't easy.
mm-hmm.
And I think finally that the most important thing that we've talked about is involvement. Like everything else that we talked about is really important.
Mm,
But if you're going to get one thing right, it's involving people and understanding in your specific context and environment and for your particular type of change that will look different for everybody, but really thinking through how you can maximize involvement whilst creating really strong guardrails so that people have a sense of actually how much control over that they do have, is absolutely critical. Yeah.
yeah, agree.
I'd
Agree.
love to get people's feedback on this topic in particular because it feels to me like this is like an enormous topic. What are the things that you want to hear about more?
Yeah. We've just
Yeah,
scratched the surface. So yes. And are there things that we've talked about today that you're like, hang on, talk more about that? What on
yeah,
earth do you mean by that? Please let us
yeah.
know. Because I think this is a really important one.
And in fact, we are getting a lot of emails and messages on LinkedIn from people about topics they want us to cover, which is absolutely brilliant. So do let us know if there's something you'd like us to talk about. The more we can make these episodes really tailored to what you need, the more helpful they're going to be for people, which is basically why we're here, isn't it, Lucy?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for spending this time with us today. Don't forget that if we want to make our voice heard and our impact felt, we need to gift ourselves the space to think, the courage to lead, and the confidence to adapt. I'm Juliet Corbett.
And I'm Lucy Gower. We hope you'll join us next time for the Quiet Leadership Revolution.